Tonight's talk is about how the anti-war movement nearly stopped the 2003 Iraq war from taking place. So you're all very welcome. Folk who have a long association with or subscription to Peace News, and folk, if this may be the first time you've come across us, you're very welcome. If you were involved back in 2003, you're very welcome. If you've more recently become involved, then it'll be great to have your thoughts and contributions. Gabriel has just put in the chat that if you have any questions during the meeting as it's going along, then you can stick them in the chat, and we'll address them as we're going along. So I'm going to do a talk, and then we'll have a Q&A session. So the topic of tonight's meeting is how we, the anti-war movement, nearly stopped the 2003 Iraq war, and it's based on an article in the latest issue of Peace News. I have written about this before, and I actually wrote 2 books about the 2003 war. One of them, this is one of the editions. One of them was War Plan Iraq, which was published just before the war took place, and the other one was Regime Unchanged, which was published in 2004. And a lot of what I'm going to say now is covered in more detail in Regime Unchanged. So there is a lot of material that's either in the Peace News article or referred to in it, and I'm going to try to simplify things by just talking about a few key dates that took place in 2003. So as everyone knows, February the 15th was an extraordinary day where there were massive anti-war demonstrations all around the world, and they had a big impact on many governments, and that is a very famous day. Before I go on, I should note 2 achievements of the anti-war movement that Noam Chomsky once talked about, which was, firstly, that this was the first time in the history of imperialism that there were major demonstrations in imperial countries before the launching of wars of aggression, and that had never happened. So that was quite an achievement, to be able to stir that up and organize that and make that happen. The other major achievement, which Chomsky talked about, was about restraining the damage that was done in the 2003 war, the invasion. Chomsky pointed out that a few decades earlier, the US was doing carpet bombing in Indochina during the Vietnam War, and there was also massive use of chemical weapons in that war as well. And neither of those things happened in Iraq in 2003. Even if you compare it with 1991, when Britain and the US were involved again in attacking Iraq, then there was a systematic targeted destruction of civilian infrastructure in Iraq, including, most damagingly perhaps, the electrical power generation distribution system, much like what Russia has been doing in Ukraine recently, except in 1991 in Iraq, it was much more thorough and effective. And in 2003, that didn't happen. And one of the reasons for that was that in 2003, unlike 1991, the US and Britain were expecting to be ruling Iraq in a few weeks, and damaging the civilian infrastructure would have harmed their own plans for how they were going to run the country. The next date I want to talk about is a date that is not well known in the West, which is the 1st of March. And that is the day that the Turkish parliament voted not to allow Turkish land or airspace to be used by the United States to invade Iraq. And that was a very big setback for the US, because there was a very large operation that was going to take place from the north. And in Turkey, the opinion polls showed over 90% of Turkish people against the invasion of Iraq. These are the people, incidentally, who the US and Britain said were so threatened by Iraq's weapons that this military action was necessary. But the people of Turkey didn't see it that way. And then the US made the mistake of trying to soften public opinion and political opinion, elite opinion, by offering a massive bribe to the Turkish government in terms of grants and other forms of assistance. And this seems to have actually enraged the Turkish people even more. And there was an even fiercer campaign to pressure Turkish MPs not to vote for the use of Turkish land or airspace for the invasion. And so amazingly, Turkish MPs did what the Turkish people wanted, which was they failed to allow the US to launch the war from their sort of airstrip non-country. The next date I want to talk about is also not well known, and it's the 11th of March. And this is the day, according to the Telegraph, right-wing British newspaper, that was the worst day of the whole Iraq crisis up to that point for the British Prime Minister Tony Blair. And the Telegraph called it Wobbly Tuesday. And that is the day that the British Defense Secretary, Jeff Hume, told his US counterpart, Donald Rumsfeld, that there were problems with British MPs and there was problems with the British public, and Britain might not, after all, be able to join in the invasion of Iraq. And instead, they might have to disentangle their forces and come in later as part of the occupation, or in their words, the peacekeeping forces. And this infuriated Donald Rumsfeld, and he mentioned this possibility publicly in a press conference later that day, and led to a transatlantic row. And the Telegraph reported that on that day, the 11th of March, officials inside the Ministry of Defense were scrambling frantically to draw up these plans for disentangling British forces from the invasion forces. And this actually was more of an issue after the Turkish vote, because the British forces were sort of mixed up in terms of aircraft and soldiers and tanks and such like with US invasion forces in the south. And now that there was no northern component to the invasion, what was happening in the south was more important, and therefore British participation was more important. So that was the 11th of March. And another date that is not remembered, or another event that is not remembered, came a few days later on the 17th of March, because that is the day that the main UN weapons inspection agency, UNMAVIC, presented its draft work program to the UN Security Council. Now, what was important about this was that the draft work program was a work plan, a plan of action. It was a set of clearly defined tasks that Iraq was supposed to carry out, which once they had been carried out and documents had been handed over, or records inspected, or personnel interviewed, once all of those actions had been carried out by Iraq and verified by the inspectors, then the inspectors could give a definitive answer on the status of Iraq's prohibited weapons, weapons of mass destruction, missiles, and so on. Oh, excuse me. And so the draft work program was supposed to initiate a final and decisive phase of inspections, which the head of UNMAVIC, Hans Blix, told the Security Council a couple of days later would not take years nor weeks, but months. So within a few months, the UN weapons inspectors would be able to say one of three things. Either we have completed the program of action and we have found there are forbidden weapons in Iraq, and presumably they would destroy them, but that they would say there are weapons, or they would say we've completed the plan of action, and as far as the evidence can tell, we are confident there are no prohibited weapons in Iraq, and Iraq was then cleared, in which case sanctions would be lifted. Or the third option was if they were to say after a few months, Iraq has not cooperated sufficiently with us for us to give you an answer. And for the US and Britain, that statement by the inspectors, they would have said would justify military action. They would have said that if there were weapons of mass destruction, which Iraq was refusing to allow the inspectors to destroy, that would have justified war. So a definitive answer would have been given within months if the draft work program had been put into action. But instead, a few hours after the document was distributed at the Security Council, US President George W. Bush issued Iraq with an ultimatum. He gave Saddam Hussein and his sons 48 hours to leave the country, otherwise there'd be war. And he also publicly ordered the UN weapons inspectors out of the country. Now, we found out later that Bush had actually told the UN to withdraw the inspectors the day before, but that would be in a private message. This was on television. He told the inspectors, you have to leave. And so the draft work program was completely drowned out, and it's been forgotten. So if the next day in the parliamentary vote in Britain, if a majority of Labour MPs in the British Parliament had not voted for war, had voted against war, there might still have been a majority in Parliament for war, but if a majority of Labour MPs had voted against war, that would have made it politically untenable for Tony Blair to carry on with being part of the invasion force. And that would have created problems for the Southern invasion force. And it's possible, we don't know, but it's possible that that might have delayed the war by maybe a few days while they rejigged how the whole force structure was configured. I don't know. But it's possible that if we'd managed to swing that vote the other way, there would have been enough time for the inspectors and the anti-war forces in the Security Council and anti-war movements around the world to point out that a non-military way of resolving the weapons issue, Iraq weapons issue, was right in front of everybody. And there were these clearly defined actions that Iraq was being asked to take, and they would either take them and a definitive answer would come, or they wouldn't take them, in which case the US and UK would take that as a justification for war. Not that the anti-war movements would have agreed with that interpretation of it, but there was this path to resolving the issue through non-military means. Obviously, the reason why Iraq was being as cooperative as it was under the threat of force. That's very clear. But there was a non-military route available, which had been opened on the 17th of March. So there are lots of complications to do with the draft work program. But I wrote at the time that I thought it would end up being the most censored document of 2003. And it just doesn't show up in the histories that have been written about the war. And in fact, even in Han Blix's own book about the inspection process, I don't think you really get a good picture of it, of what was involved and the opportunity that was there. So the opportunity to resolve things through inspections was destroyed by power, and the opportunity was also erased from history by power. But I think it's important for us to remember the 1st of March, what the Turkish parliament did because of the Turkish anti-war movement. And so it's important for us to remember Wobbly Tuesday, the 11th of March, and what the British anti-war movement forced the Ministry of Defence into doing. And it's important for us to remember the 17th of March, when the inspections route out of the crisis became a reality in a way that maybe no one would have suspected it in the months just behind it. So, you know, there are lessons from all of that for us today in terms of wars now, wars in the future. And I look forward to us discussing all of that in the Q&A.